Welcome. I want to give you one last orientation, and it's toward the end of Jung's life in an interview with a lament. If there was something that Jung lamented at the end of his life, remembering the centrality of the lament of the dead, serving the dead, the questions left unanswered, unresolved by the forefathers. Jung said in this interview that he had failed to open people's eyes to the reality of the soul and the buried treasure in the field. There is undoubtedly a multiplicity of meaning. I hope so. I think the polytheistic perspective is meant to apply to scholarship, so that I don't want to pin down as the mind as a slayer of the real, or the murder of scholars as the soul elaborates it in the Red Book through explanation, through definition, through the creation of a dead system. And yet, I think that we can look at this opening people's eyes to the reality of the soul and the buried treasure in the field as pertaining to the Red Book, the buried treasure until recently in the field of depth psychology. Also metaphorically, but meaningfully, powerfully within the field of nature herself, Mother Nature. Opening people's eyes to the reality of the soul. Jung also said in Memories, Dreams, Reflections that he tried everything in his power to teach those close to him a new way of seeing or looking at things. This is the psychology of sight and insight, this way of seeing and seeing through the psychological lens of the soul, not only in art. Again, we are creating art, the path, painted path. We ourselves are the art. Jung said you are creating yourself to Morgan, and in different ways. This is fundamentally true. We are creating and being created by the soul, soul making, and the soul making us, both reflexively. And yet we can see this in the Red Book as this way of seeing and seeing through the soul, through the personified figures of the soul, through the lens of the Red Book, which is to be viewed as a painting, as a whole. How do we see this new way of seeing? I'm going to circumambulate back to the soul who went invisibly within Jung, allowing him to see the whole in the parts. Or as Jung told Freud, as you know, I always have to begin with the whole and then move to the parts. This way of seeing the whole, atonement. How do we see the whole, and what is gained by that? I want to give you a holistic perspective here. Not only did Jung say after that it is to be viewed, it is a painting to Elijah, that this was to overcome the old and ingrained mistake that the whole excludes the parts. And again, always conversely, the parts exclude the whole. We need both, unity and multiplicity. We have that in vision, we have that in painting. The forest and the trees, the whole and the parts. To see and see through the soul, which has this dual aspect of vision. How do we apply that as a meaningful lens to our life? And here I suggest the work of Leonard Schlein, amateur depth psychologist, actually was going to be a Freudian and then a Jungian, ended up through synchronicities and different instances in his life being a laparoscopic surgeon, pioneering that, but had a number of bestsellers in the depth psychology, from Art and Physics to Leonardo's Brain. But particularly in this instance, the alphabet versus the goddess. What I'm suggesting is that what we've forgotten is this holistic way of knowing. Our valuation has been on the animus mind associated with the left hemisphere, associated with conscious, with the soul, solar, with the ego. And in Jacob Boehme, who Jung spoke of as a visionary genius, remember the left eye, the right hemisphere, looked to prehistory, to this ancient primordial soul, very much a part of the Red Book. The right eye with the left hemisphere that particularizes, that dissects into parts, math, science, engineering, scholarship in terms of traditional verbal learning. The right eye looks to eternity. It's the mystical eye, but it looks forward. Jung was very much about the superpersonal aspect of the soul that transcends time and space, connecting past and future. In this different way, we need both. We need to see the parts, to particularize, and the whole. To give you a sense of what has been lost, Leonard Shlain looked at a decrease in left-handedness. The left hand of the body is associated with bad. It used to be essentially evil, and so people were trained and then are privileging of all that is the right side, the right eye connected with the left hemisphere, has amounted to a 14% decrease in left-handedness. We have essentially conditioned ourselves to privilege the left hemisphere and this masculine way of knowing, I suggest. So remembering the whole is this way of bringing Eros again into the foreground, as Jung said. Eros, who was blinded, subjugated by Logos, the parts and the whole, bringing the two sides together. This is, of course, very Jungian. There's so much about the masculine and the feminine, spirituality and sexuality, Eros and Logos in the Red Book. This need to reclaim both, two sides of a whole together, two different ways of knowing that are interdependent, that make a whole. Again, this mandala is the archetype of wholeness. So when we look to this painted process, this path of return, we are remembering, again in this pathway, but even neural pathway, visual literacy, as an adjunct to and in balance with verbal literacy, so that we can remember the whole, we can see the big picture, we can chart our map and connect the dots, so to speak, to see what is hidden in plain sight. Some implications of this ability to navigate holistically. We can see what's coming, right? We have an ability through sight and insight to see further. Instead of the myopia of looking down and seeing the parts, we can see a larger picture. Critically, V.S. Ramachandran of phantom limb studies and renowned brain studies has correlated the left hemisphere with conformity and denial in terms of ecology and our ecological crisis, carbon sequestration, climate change, etc. I suggest that that ability to diminish the whole through the parts, conformity and denial, has worked us to a point of peril in terms of living our animal in nature through creative fantasy as earlier humanity. These four categories of repression are necessary for us to return to a homeostatic state as nature, as Eden, this garden, this well-watered land, the meaning of Eden on earth. Adam, meaning red clay. Eve, life breath. This mythos is still so much a part of our time. To return to that moment, that critical moment of division, of good and evil, of masculine and feminine. When Adam and Eve's eyes were open, remember, I've failed to open people's eyes to the reality of the soul, the buried treasure in the field. So much of the Red Book is about nature, about tree, sprouts, germs, the tree of life, this return to this Edenic state. Again, walking the animal path as the initiates of old to return to nature from within. This is what we're doing. Some other ideas beyond the ecological imperative of this process. The serpent, not only were man and woman divided in effect in that moment, but the serpent, there will be enmity towards the woman, not only between man and woman, but between nature, the earth soul represented by the serpent. This is something we're living with to our day. It wasn't until relatively recently that women were given a choice to have pain meds in labor, etc., because The pain of labor was meant to be reflective of the sin of woman, of Eve, of this first of the 4 soul stages, attributed to all of womanhood. We are very much still living in the shadow of Eve. Again, with nature, the homeostatic balance with nature, how imperative is that? In the 6th phase of extinction, in which mammals go first, and spoiler alert, we are mammals, this is an ecological imperative for our species, but for the entirety of the planet. I bind above and below God and animal in this tripartite soul. Jung's soul says, 577 of the Reader's Edition, this is alchemy, but this requires our body. This requires us remembering that we're animals, even going back to the reptile. We have that animality within us, our instincts, to reconnect with the instincts through the body, to reconnect with the earth through the body. A couple last points. In the Cornwall seminar, Jung attributed fanaticism to the loss of this painted path, this iconography, in which the soul's images were reborn as guidance systems, this navigation, giving us a vision. Without vision, people perish. This myopia that has been facilitated by the blindness of the soul. In the Red Book, not only is Salome blinded, the gods are blind. Everybody's blind at some point. Jung speaks of the blind fellow humanity. This, what is it to see? What is it to be blind? How do we see in a new way? Jung teaching this new way of looking at, seeing things. As a last note, Jung spoke of living your animal. If you don't live your animal, you will kill the animal in another, in your brother, he said, but also your sister. The fanaticism and the veiling of the body, Adam and Eve recognizing, opening their eyes, recognizing their shame, covering themselves, the fanaticism between the Abrahamic religions, all of this, I suggest, is tied into this path, that in walking this path, critically we can walk it together, widening this path for others as a way to individuate individually, but with art, critically, it was always about and is always about the collective. It's suprapersonal, a suprapersonal intelligence that connects the past and the future. Jung said that in comparison with his soul, he felt like a barbarian without past or future. This vision of the soul allows us to navigate the terrain between past and future. It may be in a circumambulation. There is no linear sequential navigation, Jung said. It's always a circumambulation of the image, but it's a way to navigate in return. So I suggest that this painted pathway, the more people who walk it, that it is invaluable. I'm not saying it's easy. The first time I walked it, I was taken to childhood sexual abuse. These stepping stones you can see as walking into the heart of darkness, a la Joseph Conrad. You can see it as walking on the core wounds of your own complexes. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's powerful, and it's a way through the darkness, critically for us collectively to return to Eden. And I cannot recommend enough the application of this process. I have tried to create a landscape that has everything that I felt was the most essential to walking this on your own. I am also creating another platform that's a teaching platform, Learning Through Art, for those who want to be held in more of a replication of the analytic setting that Jung worked in. If people feel they want that container, the vessel in alchemy, Jung's soul said, I will purify you if you become a vessel. This vessel, this container is so imperative. I have another way of walking this path if you feel like you need additional support in doing so. But please, I encourage you, begin to navigate this terrain of your own darkness. It is the only way, even though it's your way, to find your way in this terrain of essence of your soul's being.